Welcome to Macon Memories. I'm Linda Wright at Randolph-Macon College. Today I'm interviewing Professor of Philosophy Donna S. Turner. It is July 7th, 2022. Professor Turney was Professor of Philosophy at the college from 1985 to 2021. And we're going to get her memories today for Macon Memories. So Donna, tell us about your professional background, how you happened to come to Randolph-Macon to teach philosophy.
I guess the short answer is I was teaching as a sabbatical replacement for somebody at Mount Holyoke while I was finishing writing my dissertation. And I was told that it was a good idea to go on the job market to practice, to get your feet wet and kind of see what it's like, because it's a weird thing. So I did, and Randolph-Macon was one of the schools that was within a reasonable weekend drive from Philadelphia, where my then husband still lived. I went to Penn, so Philly was kind of home base. So this is like four and a half hours south. So that was the kind of idea. I drew a circle. That's as far as I was willing to go. And I got the job. So I didn't particularly have earmarked a liberal arts place. I hadn't really even thought about it because I was still writing. And my advisor said, bird in hand, you take the job. So I was excited about a few things, which were the class sizes and things like that, the opportunity to really make a difference in students' lives. So I liked that feeling of it, small community.
So who recruited you? Who was in the department at that time?
Joe Beatty, we had sort of half of my career with him and then half with Ben Huff. So Joe recruited me, and I'll never forget because Joe came to the airport to get me in a big blue down coat because he had come from, I forget where, but colder climate. So he still had this big down jacket. And it was kind of a distinctive thing here in the South to be wearing such a heavy overcoat, yeah.
I thought you were going to say he was from the South and that he thought it was so cold here. That's why he was wearing.
No, Joe had no Southern accent.
Okay. Good. So I guess this ties in with that, but who were some of your early role models and mentors at the college? And the department was small, but just in the college in general.
You know, such a small department, my connections were often outside the department, probably not at all uncommon, but we were assigned, somebody was assigned as your mentor. Those were Liddell Payne days, and Mike Wessels was assigned to me at that time, so he became a kind of mentor to me. And I'll tell you an interesting experience he and I had that had to do with KA and the Old South celebration stuff, but it was one of my very early experiences with my mentor. But Bruce and Tom Porter, Bob Offenbacher, they were really instrumental in my early years here. They convinced me to have lunch with them in what was a dreadful little place over in the old campus center, and we would kind of talk over the business of the college. So I really got my early instruction about the responsibility of self-governance and things from them.
And so you mentioned your undergrad was at Penn?
My undergrad was State University of New York up in Plattsburgh. So I grew up in New York on Long Island, flat, wanted to go to the mountains. So I went to Plattsburgh for my undergrad, where I attempted to become a 49er, which is someone who climbs all 49 peaks, which was a very bad idea for my freshman year. I spent a lot of it in the mountains. But then when I discovered philosophy, which actually was the beginning of my junior year, I got really serious about school and changed my major as a junior. So I took an awful lot of philosophy awfully quickly. But my graduate school was at Penn. So I went from Plattsburgh to Philly.
The reason I asked is I didn't know if you had much experience with a small liberal arts college.
The state university system is such that life is sort of in the major. And so there were probably 12 of us in the majors at the time, and that was a very tight-knit group. So we had dinners at our professors' houses. We sometimes met there for seminars, and we had a club that was very active. So that felt, having come to liberal arts place, that felt like, oh, that's where I got that from, my experience in the State University of New York system. I do know that when I went to Penn, which was, a little snooty place, at our sort of orientation for new students, they went around and asked people, well, who did you work with and what school did you go to? And I was like, David Mowry at SUNY, Pulaski. I felt like, oh gosh, other people were naming people at Harvard or something. But I had a really good background. I did fine. I had really good training. And so lots of the kind of thing that I think we give lots of attention and lots of instruction.
When you first came, was Burnell Panel still alive? I mean, I know he wasn't teaching at that time.
Burnell was not alive, but Mary Alita was a big part of life for us. She was a permanent fixture walking around, and she came to our events regularly and interacted with students, and I think they enjoyed the time with her. I know I enjoyed having that connection to her. Yeah, she was really great.
She was still alive when I came in 2005. I think she died not long after that. But I just know that Professor Panel, as a philosophy professor, he was just so greatly loved and had such an outsized influence on the college.
Yeah, and he was a one-man show. I mean, one-man show and a half, right? Because he was running religious, I think for a while they were doing philosophy and religion together. So yeah, I think he was really. We had a photograph. I think it's still up in Fox, of him, with his pipe.
So distinctive looking.
Because you could smoke in the classroom in those days, right? And actually, my professors in undergrad smoked in the classroom too. It was such a great theatrical prop. But we had a picture of him up on the wall. That was really sweet.
Yeah, he was so distinctive looking and distinguished, and he, administrative responsibilities. He just, I was just wondering if you had known him at all.
No, I didn't know him.
Well, since your department is so small, do you want to talk about Joe and his mentorship? I remember going to his retirement party, and you spoke so fondly of him, or of the changes in the department, or how you're coming. Who was anybody there here with Joe before you came?
Yes, and I didn't meet him, but I think he was much beloved by students, so I didn't get the scoop.
Do you know his name?
Yeah, so there was one other person with him, and it was a late search, so I'm not sure what the details of it were. And I think the other members of the search committee, like Bruce Unger was on it, because I was impressed that when they had a dinner, it was at his house.
Bruce's house.
Yeah, and that was really nice. Yeah. And it was nice to meet somebody from New York. I just feel like, oh, good. Yeah, so Joe and I were almost, opposites in terms of background, which was good because we could cover a fair amount of areas in philosophy with just two people. Kind of hard to spread that thin. My own background was in the history of analytic philosophy, so a lot of logic, and early years when philosophers were getting excited that you could use logic to do anything, and it was all about analysis and finding truth through analysis. And I started to do some women's studies, not really researchy stuff, but there was an organization called the Society for Women in Philosophy that was just sort of coming to be when I was in grad school. And I was suspicious of some things about feminism, but I ended up managing editor for a journal called Hypatia, which is the first philosophical feminist journal, which is really successful today. And that got me hooked a little bit. And then I always say that coming to the South really anchored me as a feminist. I think maybe 2 weeks here, and I thought, oh gosh, I got to take this more seriously, this feminism stuff.
Well, say more. What? I mean, I grew up in the South, so tell me more what you mean by that.
I think for me, certainly as a grad student, it was a highly conceptual thing. How does easy targets like humankind really turn out to be based on what we know about men or things like that? And how does philosophy, which is so based on rationalism and analysis, what does that have to do with gender and stuff? And so when I got here and kind of just looked around, saw what was happening in the classroom and heard some things from students, right? Because when you're young, they talk to you. I started to put things together. I do remember one of my early dinners here, meeting, administrators and people here, cabinet members. Somebody went to give me a kind of compliment about how they would have attended philosophy classes more if their professor had. And I started to sort of lean in, and I was going to say something, and George Oliver kicked me under the table to shut me up, and I thanked him later, because probably would have been by Southern standards inappropriately direct. So that was probably within just a few days of being here.
Wow. So your early days here really sparked your your interest in feminism in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think when the Old South, it feels like that was pretty early. I don't remember what time of year it was, but I was, pretty new on campus, and, there were carriages and hoop skirts and pickaninny decor, and I thought, oh my gosh,
For the record, I'll just say Old South was an annual tradition from the KA fraternity where they reenacted Southern traditions, antebellum traditions.
Right, and they were very proud of it. It was a big deal. It was clear that some real preparation and dollars had gone into this as an event, and I just was astounded that was not only that it was happening, but that it was sort of couched and framed in such the sort of gloss of tradition and nostalgia, and so I talked to Mike about feeling very uncomfortable with that, and we arranged for a conversation with KA leaders to kind of talk about what those things meant outside of their intended meaning, right? As philosophers, we think of meaning as socially constructed, not just what you're thinking in your head. I don't even know what they thought they were thinking in their head. But so we got, gussied up for that talk and went over to the Brown Center. The Brown Center was still around, and walked into that room, and there were probably 30 men in suits.
When you said KA leaders, did you mean students?
We thought we meant students.
Oh, but you meant KA like national?
No, we thought we meant like whatever the leadership was on campus.
But they brought in their
they did.
national.
They brought in lawyers with clipboards, and it's like, okay, we certainly weren't threatening anything legal or anything, but so we had a conversation there, and I think that went okay, and I think things went away. That at least maybe we could say that event was pushed indoors. It wasn't publicly displayed anymore, but things like that were kind of disturbing. Yeah, and students in those days, students told me that the women, the sororities would clean the restrooms for the fraternities, and
They paid?
no, what's going on here and stuff. And then there was I don't know how much dirty laundry to air. I think there was a near or explicit pornographic film shown during a student orientation, and students kind of complained about that. So we needed some work around some of this stuff. And I was young, and I was sort of fearless, and so kind of took that on. Yeah, and that was certainly directly part of the trajectory to things like the non-discrimination policy. I think we did 3 at once: non-discrimination, harassment, and what was then called the student affairs policy.
Okay, I do want to ask about that. So let's see. Let's say more. Let's kind of get into that. I just had a question or a comment about that you had an important part in the formation of the non-discrimination, sexual harassment, and Title IX policies.
I mean, my part, would say, I mean, lots of people, we wrote, lots of us wrote. And eventually, our attorney looked at that and kind of helped with that. But convincing the college that things that were law in 1973 needed some attention in the 80s. We didn't have some things in place at the time, and so there were sort of a series of events. I know there was a Take Back the Night event, and some of this was pre-women's studies, so I don't really remember who did it.
That was a national event, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I sort of remember that.
And we were yelled at in a foul manner at that event, and
By students?
yes, and so I kind of reported it. Ira was dean, this as a complaint. We had conversations about it, and it wasn't going anywhere. Then some other things happened. I came to campus on a weekend, roller skating with Mary Jo Berger, who was a good dear friend and a very powerful mentor for me here. She was in the dean's, in the student's office. Wasn't called what it is now. Dean of Students office then,
Yes.
and then also taught in the English department.
Okay.
And we would come on the weekend, her granddaughter and Max, and we would kind of walk around. And somebody yelled out of what was then the fraternity across the street from where I would park, yelled something out at me, which was entirely inappropriate. And so I kind of turned around and said, "Do you have any idea how foolish that is? I'm going to report you." And so we did. And so there were maybe a couple more things like this. I think that my window got a brick thrown through.
Office window or home?
Yeah.
Here,
Here.
office window.
And campus security said, no, that couldn't have been an accident, that kind of thing. But anyway, we kind of used some of that to try and put pressure on having a policy on non-discrimination and sexual harassment. And that was slow going. And I took some risks. I went outside the college and was told there wasn't enough kind of personal damages to me for anything legal. Then it turned out that, serendipity, there was a connection here with someone who had a connection with the Office of Civil Rights. And she helped me to meet and convince them that we should do something. And what they were agreeing to do was have these policies. So that was the sort of the birth of working on those policies. And we started with those three.
The sexual harassment and non-discrimination.
And the student affairs. And amorous relations. I think that might have been the name of the policy. No. Yes, I know. Unfortunate name, right, between faculty and students.
Well, those things were evolving and those were struggle. You said, it was slow going or slow to get traction. That's true nationally. So it wasn't just Randolph-Macon, just sexual harassment policies were slow to catch on in so many places. Yeah.
We're 10, 15 years behind.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the way the law runs, you're supposed to be compliant with your own policies. And so if you don't have any, it's hard to establish noncompliance, right? So it was important to get those things on paper, and there wasn't a lot of interest in the pressure. I remember Russ Shea, who became a very, very dear friend. He helped me with the Title IX part because he was very committed to athletics, and had some relationship. And so was able to sort of help navigate that a little bit, and that was really helpful. Yeah, so having that kind of support was really important. But I remember feeling kind of like, come on.
Right.
Yeah.
A little bit like you were trying to push this alone or something? Who were some of the people who were helping with those initiatives?
Well, certainly later there were people who were helping to write, and then, basically the entire campus kind of enacts. But I was kind of out there in terms of not letting it go. And some people were actually saying, just let it go. And I would say the same thing about feminism in the classroom. So as I started to teach women's studies courses, sometimes students would complain that I was too feminist or something. And
Male students or both?
I think male, but women too. And it was pre-tenure, and I had used a very famous article on compulsory heterosexuality. And that was the thing that seemed to be pushing the button, right? And when I was being reviewed, Mike Wessels again helped me to get the committee on the faculty to put a group together that could interpret the student responses, because they were not uncommon in these kinds of courses. And I remember calling colleagues, very well-established colleagues at big universities, and some of them said, drop the article and get tenure. Just don't fight this now. And I didn't want to do that.
Because you're a teacher.
Right, but I will say that was hard. That was hard here. But I will say that I was really impressed, because what worked is that what was then Committee on the Faculty, and that process did form a sort of third-party group to mitigate and kind of interpret what those responses were about, and produced a sort of, I don't know, judgment or a set, a perspective, which at a huge place, they would have said, "Good luck, baby," right? So that really worked. But there were things in the classroom which were, you're kind of hitting those walls at every place. And I think that was pre having the women's studies major. So, I was teaching probably the baby course, the baby intro to women's studies course, which was called Women's Nature, and it had scare quotes around it to indicate it was about the concept, but the computer and registrar processes couldn't handle that, so those got dropped.
So it was just called Women's Nature,
Yes,
and not with quotes.
Yeah, it was up until when I stopped teaching. And I do remember I had a male student who after the first day said, I thought we were going to learn about chicks. And I said, "Oh, you are." but not in the way you're hoping.
Oh, good on you, instead of coming back in an angry way or whatever. Yeah. How did that turn out for that student?
I think he did fine. There was always a disproportionate amount of women to men. Almost the flip for philosophy is always mostly men, and still a pretty male-dominated discipline. So it was sort of the opposite in that particular class. But that was the baby one, and then there was feminist theory, the upper division course, which is probably my favorite course, to teach, because you have students who are really committed and not just trying to figure out what you want them to say. So that was a really great experience, kind of like heaven on earth. What you go into college teaching thinking it's going to be like all the time. There's a fair amount of that. Those are the golden moments.
That's great. Well, talk a little bit about the development of the Women's Studies program, because you were instrumental in getting that as first a program, then a minor, then a major. Yeah.
There, Charlotte and BJ and Mary Edwards Kitteman, who I didn't know as long, but I knew Charlotte and BJ. Yes, and they were pals, and I suppose I knew Charlotte the best because we had adjoining offices over it when we were in Thomas Branch for some years. But they had certainly, I think, gathered and talked about things before. And so there was some support out there. There were certainly courses out there, right? So we did baby steps. I think we had an area emphasis,
Yeah, they do
right,
have-
which was a thing which didn't mean anything, but anyway, that was the first thing,
Yes.
right? It was a non-thing, but
Yeah.
that was the first thing.
But in the catalog, you could have an area of emphasis, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think some majors talk about concentrations. I'm not sure we've ever had sort of standardized language over those sub-minor kinds of things. But yeah, we started with that, and then we're trying to grow it up to having a major. And that was one thing. The sort of simultaneous thing that was happening was that it was going to be clear that we needed a person. We needed some staffing. And that's a whole different level of serious commitment on the part of the college, right? But they were in a position of having those courses in, say, I don't know, 6 or 7 different disciplines being taught out of love, right? You know, I love this, so I'm going to teach whatever. And so they could go away, right, if extra courses were needed for, you know, a 101, or if a person left, right? They were attached to the person, not necessarily to the discipline or the department. And so it was a little hairy, right, and precarious to be able to predict, right? Because the way that the process went, I functioned as director for a while. The way that the process went was, you know, Joe and I would sit down and say, this is what we're doing for philosophy. So everybody within their major figures out what they have to do. And then the women's studies stuff came after people knew what their obligations were for in their department, because they were hired in their field, right? So this was sort of icing on the cake. And so that became very difficult, right, to organize a major if you had to see, well, what could we get, basically, right? So it discouraged a rigorous or hierarchical set of requirements for the major, right? Because it's just like, well, any of these will do, please, right? So it became clear that we were going to need a position in women's studies. And mind you, there really isn't a discipline of women's studies, at least then, right, 80s and 90s, right? And so finding someone with, I mean, I had no course background in women's studies or in philosophy at all. It was just stuff that, you know, people started reading in groups. These Society for Women in Philosophy would read and kind of make connections on their own, and then make stuff up, like sort of invent it, you know, as you went. And so finding somebody with that kind of background, you really had to find somebody in a discipline. And so that was kind of the choice. Can we get a real women's studies person, or do we get someone in a discipline who teaches women's studies? And at the time, and probably still, they are more prominent in the social sciences, right? And so I think it was Jerry Garris, who was a very good advocate in a lot of ways. He was certainly a good advocate through the whole Title IX process. He was, in fact, our default Title IX officer, though we weren't actually doing any of that. And so he really joined in on that once that all got going. So did Liddell, but I'll tell some stories about Liddell, who I'm very fond of also, because he was really part of my early years here. But getting that all started was tricky, and Jerry had advised us in writing up the proposal for the person, for the position, that to ask for a new position, well, now this is like, we're back in the hot, deep end of the pool on this one, right? New positions are hard to come by. For a field which would be, in some sense, non-existent to the cabinet. What's women's studies? So it's not like, right. So now, he said, I just wouldn't even fight the battle. Because you first have to, it's a non-existent thing. So we don't have tenure, we can't have a tenure track in a field that doesn't exist, right? So, and part of that was politics, but part of it was true, right? There really wasn't a discipline well established in the field. So we wrote it for I think sociology and got and that's kind of how that worked. But that was tremendous support on the part of our provost at that time to give us a position that would then have a home, right, to be able to cover things.
So who filled that initially?
That was Deborah Rodman.
Oh, okay. So when Deborah came, that she was going to be the center or the grounding element. Okay, good. And she's still a teacher.
That was an enormous, I think, accomplishment. I feel in some ways more proud of that than of the major. I mean, I introduced the major on the floor. We used to meet upstairs in Peel Hall, and it was very different. It was loose. Jerry would sort of script Robert's rules as we went, but they went on forever. They were at night, and they went on forever. And anyway, we were really excited when that went through without any opposition. But that was the sort of year of interdisciplinary majors we got. So that was kind of
And Black Studies around the same time?
later. Environmental studies maybe earlier. Right, so interdisciplinarity was being kind of focused on a little bit more, and now that's a really big part of who Randolph-Macon is. But that excited me a lot, and actually took me back before undergrad. I just had a interest in everything, so I started off a French major, elementary ed, then discovered philosophy. But in the meanwhile, I really thought I should do anthropology, and I read a lot of literature, and I was all over the place. But when I was in high school, I think this is where that comes from, interdisciplinarity. I went to a very big high school on Long Island, 3,000 students, and they took 100 students. They called it a free school, and we were given, I think, 3 classrooms and 4 faculty members. We had no requirements. And, we were supposed to make up what we were going to do, self-design curricula, and just do what we wanted. Now, the only oversight on that, and this is a serious thing, is New York State has regents exams. And they're more than the outcomes-based things they do now. They were serious exams. And so I had to take the chemistry one. Well, I decided I didn't really want to study chemistry. I started reading existentialism and art history, and I did these projects on the descendants of whalers that were on the North Shore of Long Island. I would ride my bike up there and interview people and write up the stuff. I did a Piaget study in a local elementary school. I did really cool things. Not a lot of chemistry all year. And then freaked out, right, because the regents were coming and did, I don't know, the year's worth of labs in 2 weeks, and I think I scored the highest in the high school, so that doesn't tell you much about how those exams really give feedback. But it gave me a real love for following across lines of fields of knowledge, and women's studies was really I had a passion for that, in part for that reason. You really couldn't pick one thing out without having to trace it in many, many, many directions.
Mm-hmm. And a love for just following an idea or an interest and see where it takes you. I mean, the image of you're riding your bike to interview the descendants of whalers, that's wonderful.
Oh, it really was amazing. It was, and the fact that I, knocked on people's doors and they talked to me. I did this kind of thing, and then I wrote these things up, and I don't know what kind of thing it was that I produced. It was, I don't know, biography and social history or something, but it involved images of scrimshaw and whaling practices and stuff, and it was really an exciting thing. And the Piaget stuff, I don't know how I got a hold of Piaget in high school. I don't know how I found the things I did, but I just sort of found them. I remember reading stuff about abstract realism and things in art, and the Piaget stuff I stumbled upon, and the local grammar school let me do a study. I had hand-drawn charts where I was observing behavior, and I don't know how good it was as what would be social science, but Piaget turns out to be somebody who shows up in different approaches to the mind, even in philosophy classes. So those had formative kind of experiences for me. And that, to me, is part of what I loved about doing things here. Not having a set number of things that I had to do, but sort of inventing what I wanted to do. So I think the only course I actually used, maybe two, a textbook in. So anti-textbook, that's what I'm talking about, right? So I'd use odd text, but primary texts, right? And so students would learn to read different kinds of things and figure out this is actually prose, or this is theory per se, or this has some social history in it, or like different kinds of genres. And but medical ethics was one thing I actually used a textbook for. And that was, I think, very problematic. I think the field is very problematic. So I also used other kinds of things like narratives about illness and things like that. But when we were at Penn, they had somebody smart who said everybody's going to need to know how to teach medical ethics. And so no matter what your specialty was, and it's a highly specialized, right? I didn't do a master's. I went straight from undergrad to graduate school, so I really didn't know what I was doing, right? So I just found something that looked deep and cool and did it. But they said everybody's going to have to teach medical ethics, and they were spot on. And so that was part of, I think, why I got hired here. And Joe Beatty's ad, assuming since he was the only other person in the philosophy department, he pretty much wrote that ad. You know, he could say things like, we need people who can teach the Enlightenment, the modern philosophy course, medical ethics, feminism, you know, sort of all over the place. And I was like, oh, I can do these things. So, but anyway, medical ethics textbooks are very oriented around like big, exotic topics, life and death, and sort of rare things. And I really disliked that approach because it was short sections and not entire narratives, right? So you didn't get to see something, I don't know, it was like reading a novel versus short stories or something. And so I disliked that, but I really liked having students being able to really delve into something and follow it through and weigh it against a very different kind of text.
And it does seem like, I think your professors, like you say, were right. It does seem like medical ethics are something that we all think about. I mean, we're in the, I was going to say the middle of a pandemic. I hope we're not in the middle of one. I hope we're at the end of one.
I don't know what they're calling it now. The beginning of a second one, the resurgence, something like that.
But people are thinking about all those issues.
Teaching medical ethics my last semester, it was, you know, it was not all COVID all the time, but
But people could relate.
they were also scared, right? Because at the beginning, now people are worn down, right? But the kids were nervous and scared. And so it was on their minds. And the connections between something that's happening in medicine and public life are now part of their everyday life, every day. So it was a good kind of a case study to go through, yeah. And I hope they continue to do it, especially with having nursing.
Oh, I think so. Now that we're adding nursing and the physician's assistant program, we're getting into so many medical specialties that medical ethics, it might be less, I don't know this, but I'm just thinking it could be less part of our curriculum and more theirs.
And that's somewhat problematic, because if it's done from like you could have a professional ethics course in business school, and what that means is kind of like here's the mores and the conventions and things for the profession, not what a philosopher does is think outside of anybody's independent ties and convictions to ask the questions, and that's a very different kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, another type of class you were involved in, you were an early advocate of service learning courses. Would you like to talk about how you got interested in that and how you promoted those?
I'm trying to think how Alva and I kind of, I think, okay, so philosophy is ultra theoretical, right? So in other disciplines, people would say their capstone is they get students to a theory course. And Ben and I would be like, that's all we got. We don't have anything else. We got theory. So the challenge is to constantly find ways to have that engage and apply in students' experiences. That's not the same thing as service, but you can see the connection, right? Once you're looking for roots to where does this happen, right? So if you're going to say, what is mind, right? A mind is rational thought. Okay, tell me a story in which rational thought is a feature. Like, in what circumstance does this actually arise? And who's there? What are they saying? What are they doing? What country are they in? You know, are they eating? Right? How does this come up in actual life? So we had to always do that, right? Because I don't know, 18, 19. That's an age where high theory isn't everybody's love of life. Some of them, very much their love of life, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. So to try and constantly think about where does this play out in your life, is in a way looking for a connection to lived experience, philosophers would say, right? What's going on in your life. And so that's part of the connection with service learning. And only more radical, I would say, instead of sort of starting with the theory and then thinking of a place where you could make it apply, the other way around, starting with the experience and what theory grows out of it, what theory looks like it makes sense. So I thought, gosh, philosophy would be perfect for this, right? Because we certainly have the front loading of theory part down. So finding experiences that would cause a kind of intersection, even if it's a hard intersection between what you're learning that philosophers say. For example, the one that we started with was a course on personal identity. What is it to be a person? So if you have what philosophers say, well, to be a person is to be a rational thinker, right? And then in our case, we were working with people initially at Arc of Hanover, maybe who don't have the same ways of thinking, right? So what would the theory say about them? How do they fit in? And you don't even have to do much with that. You just keep studying those things, and the kids in interacting with we call them guest students, the people from Hanover Arc, we're constantly making comparisons, right? They're better at this than we are. We're better at that. That theory doesn't include them. It was really a powerful kind of a thing. But I don't know that it wasn't born of the invitation to think outside the box by the curriculum, right? So in the old curriculum, which is 2 curriculums ago now, right? As I said, I'm always looking for connections between what philosophers say and what's happening in students' lives, right? In the part of life that they can see. But that's at a kind of a personal level, right? So you're just doing that one-on-one. But I think when we had the FYC, the first year experience curriculum, there was an invitation to, think outside the box. You have a whole year. You can work with somebody. You can do in and outside the classroom. It was like hard to even wrap your mind around it. And that's where I think service learning became something that was possible for me to do service learning in the classroom. And then it just seemed to be, we need to do this in lots of places. Yeah. And so when we lost that program, the funding for that program, and then that program, we found ways to continue doing the service learning courses through regular classes. And we'd say something like, this class includes reading theory and novels and blah, 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 and blah, 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 and service learning. So they kind of know they were in for something.
And of course, now in the current new curriculum 21, there is the, and I guess before, but the experiential learning component that could be service learning or some other type of experience, but that can be incorporated.
Yeah, but lots of other things are
included in that.
Right, and so
travel abroad is considered.
Right.
Yeah.
It certainly challenges students to do service learning. They're doing things they may not have otherwise chosen to do, right? And so they're not necessarily with people just like them. and that can be uncomfortable, right? So I think that part was really effective too, really effective. We just went down, we just discovered Hanover Arc has a thrift store now, so we're just bringing a bunch of our supplies. We're just clearing out things and bringing a bunch of those supplies down to them from that course. COVID kind of,
Yeah, COVID put a,
the pandemic kind of ended that population, and yeah, being able to interact in those ways. But when this is over, can we say when, not if? When this is over, maybe those things will come back up. But yeah, service learning in philosophy was almost like an oxymoron, like just not there because of the sort of
the theoretical versus.
yeah, sort of pureness or whatever of it. So so that was a nice way to start to sort of think about, well, what are the boundaries of philosophy? Why isn't it about service, right? What is that way of thinking have to do with reality, truth, right? The sort of fundamental questions that philosophers ask. So I really loved doing that. And then we had some other support programs for service learning too, and I don't know if some of those are gone, but really having that invitation to do something really different and exciting and a year long, gosh, I've seen some of the folks from that program and they still remember. Some of them have ongoing ties with students. Some of the things we didn't even know were happening.
That's awesome.
Yeah, there was a really cool guy in our class, and he gave up going to some like really cool frat party thing to go to a social event with his guest student and their family. Like, not cool. I mean, just, yeah. And I also remember having students, again, male students, I guess you kind of see the change in them the most, who really were changed. And when they did their like final reports at the end, they were kind of tearing up and
But it had moved them so
gosh,
much.
this was worth it. This is what knowledge does, folks, right? Changes you from the inside out. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I know people are doing things.
But you're right. That's the kind of thing the students will always remember. They may not remember a lot from coursework, but they'll remember those experiences for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. We still, Alva Hughes and I still talk about how much impact that had on us as professors and the way that we did things. We did a travel course to Brazil, which was amazing. And we would, I think Zika came after that year, the Zika virus, so that was the end of that. And then lots of problems in Brazil. So that unfortunately didn't get to happen again. But it was a service learning course, and they were going to do some service learning in the favelas, which are very poor neighborhoods outside the big cities, Rio and El Salvador. And they think the students probably thought we were going to paint like a couple of walls or something. And we were working with a women's collective, painting inside and out of a building. Paint in Dixie cups, crumbling walls. I just painted at home recently and was complaining about old walls being, bumpy, and this was, stuff falling out.
Concrete
Yeah.
falling down.
And it was amazing for them, and those women had us over to their homes for meals after working, after our painting and things. We had to be accompanied walking around the favelas. We weren't as liability conscious, I guess, in those days, but it was an amazing learning experience. They read philosophical things in the evenings, wrote journals, and but it was service learning, and I think it was really effective for that reason.
And just taking them somewhere they would never go, or out of their idea of a world, just completely different world.
Yeah, and you see photos of the favelas, and they look like, pastel-colored shacks, and look kind of beautiful, and they're in the mountains. The poverty is on the outside of Rio, not in the middle of Rio, opposite of Manhattan, I guess. And, and then you get in there and see, this is built on a garbage heap. And there are regularly slides and people's homes are devastated. So I think it was an amazing experience for the kids.
Well, we've talked about a lot of your academic work and experiences. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about some extracurricular work, service to the college. Just want to note that you were chair of the executive committee of the faculty, among other college service, and see if you wanted to talk about any college service.
Yeah, it was such an experience of community in some ways. I remember standing outside Peel Hall after an executive committee meeting, talking about with Terry Winiger and with Bruce and Tom, talking about what we need to do to make the college better. You just be there doing it. I think, I'll say this, it might sound wrong, but I think in some way we've become more professional about what we do, and we do lots more kinds of things. So our faculty meetings are run, on a tight schedule. And like I said, we'd be there till 10, 11 at night because we were still, trying to make things better or, get things done. So anyway, the committee service was part of community work. The executive committee was, when I first got here, they might have been in a self-study. And so I was put on a self-study committee, I think right away. And and I was like, whoa.
New person, you're on the committee, you're chair.
Right, I think everybody had to be part, yeah. I was on one self-study committee with Dave Brad and with Bruce Unger, and that they had very vocal opposing views. Yes. But anyway, executive committee I got put on, and then I became chair. And I don't know how come I became chair. I think other people there were chairs, right? So I was fairly new, sort of cutting my teeth on that experience. But the kind of business that fell to us then were things that fell through the cracks. I remember looking at the fact that our students only took 4 courses, and many other colleges it was 5, and an hour here means 60 minutes. An hour is almost like a Freudian hour. Everywhere else it's 50 minutes. So if you count the minutes, they're the same, and so it wasn't a lighter load is what was the point of it. So we looked at things like that and track schedules and stuff, but that committee has certainly ended up with bigger business in a way, as the faculty has grown and as programs have grown and so forth. Yeah, I was on the committee on the faculty, and everybody puts their time in there. You do a couple of stints on the committee on the faculty, and it's just a real lot of work, but also wonderful to see what people do, how hard they work and stuff. Yeah, and an amicable, I would say, relationship with the provost, certainly I was there with Jerry and then also Rob Hollier, in terms of advocating for faculty. It's after that, I'm trying to think if it was with Rob's position when the advocacy for the faculty got dropped from that job description. So that went from dean to provost. So maybe in that era when the position went from dean to provost, the job description was no longer serving at the pleasure of the president and advocate for the faculty. It was just the former. And I think that's made an enormous difference in terms of what that person has to do. So I enjoyed administrators who half of their job description was being an advocate for the faculty. And yes, you can be an advocate when you don't have it as part of your job, but it's certainly structurally enormously more powerful if it is. So anyway, that was a different kind of experience there on the committee on the faculty. Yeah, and I was on curriculum committee, which was really lots of fun in the hot years when there was a lot of conversation about getting rid of the new curriculum, which was the FYC curriculum. I was one of the diehards who really loved it, but it was a lot of work, and not everybody wanted to do it, and we lost funds, and it was a different kind of a lot of work. I think people, it kind of required more work across disciplines, and so.
And it put, if I recall some of those discussions, it puts a lot of pressure on the majors or staffing the courses for the upper level if people, it became this whole, in some departments, unsustainable balance or whatever. They said philosophy could handle it.
I always just said, we had Ben and I, we had two people.
Yeah.
And we taught, we supported women's studies in a big way, Asian studies, environmental studies, in big ways, and regularly taught for the FYC. But we had the freedom to be sort of liberal about what we wanted to do in the discipline, because there's just so much. There's not a rote curriculum for a philosophy major. Now, we were both committed to breadth, and again, like Joe, Ben and I did pretty much opposite kinds of things. So yeah, we never taught American. We would joke. Aesthetics. There were a couple of things we just didn't get around to, but I think Ben and I each would teach more than 10, 12 different courses. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you're in a field where you can and have to be more selective and more narrow-minded, you don't teach 12 different areas, right? And so in some ways what came with that was the ability to make things fit across lots of kinds of lines. So it suited what we were doing, but I could certainly see how not if there was a sense that you wouldn't be a real blank department if you didn't have these particular courses, right? Yeah. I mean, we always felt we didn't have, we were always committed to running some things like ancient, which went right up to the medieval period, and modern, which started, I'd kind of crank it back to Copernicus or something, but, still left some gaps there, right? In order for our students to have, a proper background so that they could get through.
Good. Well,
trying to think what other committee work. I hardly remember it now.
That's probably good.
Yeah, no, I did a lot of the governance work. I don't know if it was even on committees, to do all those policies and.
Oh, yes, because we already talked about that, the sexual harassment title. You were doing a lot.
In some ways, it didn't seem like it came from a committee, as a regular committee, but yeah, I did lots of committee work.
But writing those policies and pushing those initiatives, and even the Women's Studies program, right, which was not committee work per se, but pushing all those initiatives forward was a lot of extra work, yeah, and long lasting. Right. So. And
then eventually we have a non-discrimination committee, but initially when we were getting the policy, it didn't come from a committee. It came from sort of connecting things that they're going on and committed and interested parties, yeah. But it's kind of how you make a lot of your relationships.
I just want to change gears a little bit. You incorporated some of your personal interest in your professional life in some creative ways. Would you like to talk about some of your interests outside of academics, like the outdoors, film, and especially knitting? I have a lot of memories of you knitting in faculty meetings.
Yeah, right. Alicia Hilliard once said, well, things are falling apart around here. Some people are putting things together. And I don't know. I think it certainly doesn't decrease your ability to listen, is what I'm saying. But I think when I may have had some students, I had maybe one or two knitters in class, and I've had other students who do other little crafty things, and I do look to make sure they're listening, so I understand that may not.
In fact, it helps some people concentrate.
Yes.
I'm sort of like that, what they call kinetic, or that.
People doodle, right? That's more socially acceptable.
Right. It helps you kind of focus sometimes.
Right, than the knitters, yeah. And we just found a bunch of yarn, which we have to get to. I think there's still a group.
On campus?
Yes, a student group. And we'd run some of those one day.
Learn to knit workshops.
Yes.
I loved those in J-term. And we loved it when the knitting group used to meet in the library.
Yes,
on Wednesday afternoons or whenever. I'm hoping once this renovation is complete and we put things back together, we can become more of a place for groups like that to meet. The pandemic has really thrown a wrench in a lot of that.
I also think that I think that faculty lives are awfully filled up more. So I don't know how much of that sort of time there is to just sort of live on campus and do, like you said, the things that you love or whatnot.
And even if it's student-led, we would love that, to just have the students come in. We used to, I mean, when Ginger was here, remember, we had this big box.
Ginger taught me to knit.
Oh, did she? Oh, we're
Taught me to knit.
talking about Ginger Young, the former library director.
Yeah.
Oh, always, you're such a beautiful artist.
Such an amazing knitter. Yes, she taught me to knit, and yeah, made me love it.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. But remember, we always had yarn and needles behind the the
Right.
circulation desk for people to,
Right.
and not check out, but just like, oh, she would just voice them on you, and people would bring their work in if they dropped a stitch or got things out of whack. She was always doing.
And we did some of that within Copley as well,
Yeah.
kind of when people were newly knitting or something, and kind of catch them up or
People would bring in their problems.
right. And it was nice too, because you could get people from the community, from the local knitting groups. This was pre our current knitting store, yarn store,
Yes.
but we'd get people from different knitting groups at churches and things, and they'd come in on that day, because it really is best if you have an experienced knitter and a novice, so you need lots of new people. And so that was kind of nice for the connection between outside of the college and inside of the college, yeah.
Well, you mentioned that you did want to tell a story. I can't remember if it was about Liddell or Jerry Garris. Somebody you wanted to mention a story about.
I know that Liddell and I had some tense times over the non-discrimination stuff, and he was funny too. Liddell had a kind of very sarcastic streak to him that was really funny, and that kind of helped me as we navigated that terrain, he and I, and so we were having conversations about what is and isn't okay for faculty to do, and I think in sort of getting frustrated, I said, well, what if, I think this was whether or not there was a way to hold faculty accountable prior to having all these policies. And I said, well, what about that moral turpitude phrase? And I said, if somebody kills, if there's a murder, and he said, only if you have the body. The lights are going out on you there.
Yeah, they must be, but hopefully they won't turn the lights out on us. Well, I think we do. That's probably a signal we probably need to wrap things up. But what do you see as some of the watershed events in the life of the college during your time? Or some of the biggest issues faced or that the college might be continuing to face? Did you have any philosophical thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are on race and gender issues. Certainly during my time, I would certainly say race has not receded at all. I certainly know students and have had students who were, they stayed, but they had a lot to say about what was really difficult for them. So I would say that's right there. I know there was some real work done recently, and hope that makes a difference. I was certainly part of various versions of that kind of investigation or analysis around issues of race, and wasn't really sure where the reports went. This was previous presidents, where the reports went. So I certainly hope that, I know lots of people worked hard, and I know lots of students who worked hard as well. So I would certainly say issues of race are certainly in their face. And I think the issues now are getting sort of swallowed by a bigger shark. There are the pressures from the issues that are spin-off from the pandemic are certainly enrollment issues and so forth. Adapting and growing are certainly big challenges for the college. Keeping alive or as surviving is of course crucial, but it's not inspirational, right? It can't be your ultimate goal. You survive for a reason. So having the kind of commitment to a diverse community of learning, which involves then people of color and different kinds of people, being able to be comfortable and having them represented in what they're learning and so forth. That, I think that continues to be a big struggle for us. It'll take a different shape.
And so the national emphasis on those issues, which came into clear focus during the pandemic and, continue to be highlighted. And, so I think the good thing about that is it keeps the light shining on that in a way that the other issues that you mentioned, the, pandemic issues or enrollment or other things could have hidden, but I think that light is shining brightly on all of those things.
It just means that, you still need torch carriers or committed people beyond just the job of filling the seats. And I'm not in any way understating the difficulty of the challenges that, I'm gone now, but I've heard of some of them, and it's D-Day here, and so, but certainly, remembering where we came from and what's important, and keeping a steady emphasis on that is going to be very important over the years. There's some projects that we had been working on that got kind of slowed down for various reasons with race in the community, and I hope some of those get picked back up too, with Alicia and with others here.
Well, Donna Turney, I want to thank you for coming in to Making Memories, and I want to give you the last word if there's any other memory or story or anything you'd like to share.
I recently found some photographs of, you clear out when you retire, so I found some photographs of some kind of celebration events that we had in women's studies. So they really brought back that, the kind of camaraderie and ties that you form when you've worked hard with people on something that wasn't necessarily welcome, and the kind of deepness of those connections, those I think are what lasts for me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.